It should be a woman's right to choose a life that is appropriate to her.
Anything that says women should behave like this and that, or be like this and that, is at the heart of misogyny.
And yet, against logic, we are indoctrinated into relationship structures that wildly cling to traditions rooted in sexism that, in turn, reinforce gender roles and power struggles.
This video examines some of these fundamental behaviours that contribute towards the diffusion of sexism through relationships, and, in particular, heterosexual monogamy.
It should also be said that every single relationship structure has the potential to be misogynistic. There are plenty of resources that advise on how to be better in relationships, but many of these flirt around the problematic edges of being red light boxes that men should tick in order to be successful with and valuable to women.
This can also encourage a goal-oriented approach to relationships, robbing the individualism of women. One size just doesn't fit all. Some actively exploit the current paradigm of oppression for monetary gain.
It's a confrontational subject matter, and we wish to explore angles that you may not have considered concerning misogyny in monogamy and dating culture. We are taught early on in our lives to fulfill all kinds of bizarre societal expectations, including figuring out what it means to be a woman or a man. One particular egregious example is this very oppressive dichotomy we hear all too often in society and the media. If a woman doesn't want to have sex, she's a prude, and if she does, she's a slut. It seems like that doesn't add up. But actually, it completely adds up because that's how one of the forms of oppression works. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. It's not a system in which women are being given an opportunity to win. This system is designed to leave women vying for approval. Seemingly in society, women that don't want to have sex are given value by men, and women that do are shamed and called sluts. Conversely, men are celebrated for their sexual exploits and promiscuity. It seems as if there is no acceptable way for a woman to behave in a patriarchal world, because the fundamental design is built around how women can be controlled. This is the product of a heteronormative power struggle that our history is bound up in.
As a result, a common relationship complex is that men will pursue and marry a woman with whom they are fundamentally not sexually compatible, whilst desiring women that they might perceive as whorish, also known as the Madonna-Whore Complex. This is because they've been taught that a woman who doesn't like sex is more pure. The most problematic side of this complex is the idea that men should want to have sex with people that don't want to have sex with them. A warped glorification of the idea that, for men, to get a woman that doesn't want to have sex with them is an achievement. Sex becomes a reward and validation of masculinity. We don't need to look far to spot these kinds of predatory, goal-oriented romances that start from hostility in the media. The slut-shaming expression, "why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free," harmfully highlights the goal-oriented nature of toxic masculinity in dating and the myth that sex is ultimately for men and to be earned by men.
Now, on the other side of the coin, a recent study revealed that, on average, women are less attracted to men whom they could control or manipulate. Heterosexual monogamy puts all genders in particular binary roles, a product of patriarchal ideas of femininity and masculinity, respectively passive and active. So the overly agreeable man that says yes to everything is taking on a passive role, which is related to femininity, which is perceived as unattractive. And it's this exact line of thought, the line of thought that connects a man's supposed passivity with the stereotypes that shape our understanding of femininity, which brings up issues of homophobia. It's for this reason that misogyny is such a multifaceted and complex term bound up in all these other issues.
The other side to this is that overly toxic, dominant, and even predatory men escape the overly agreeable man paradigm, meaning that toxic masculine traits can become part of a gender-normative notion of what women should find attractive in men. This is an internalized form of misogyny and the result of these preconceived, polarizing gender roles that we feel we are all meant to fulfill. It's a very layered complex reinforcing both sides, and so it's important for us to reflect on what we are looking for in romance, where our attractions stem from, and how we pursue them.
This idea of female purity has been allowed to thrive to a dangerous level. How often do we see the overly protective father figure trope in the media suppressing and shaming their daughter for having sexual feelings and threatening any man that comes near her, passing this off as protecting her innocence, instead of being able to make her own decisions? This is the father figure trope that wants his daughter to be a pristine trophy just like his wife. This is also why virginity is so incomprehensibly important in societies despite being an invented construct.
Over 20 countries have been documented as having virginity checks to make sure the hymen is quote-unquote intact, so that the man can be the one to go where no man has gone before and deflower. Following this harmful train of thought, women with prior sexual experience are perceived as less valuable and less worthy of pursuit by men. Is a penis really so magical that it can completely redefine a woman, or is it a fantasy trip to serve the male ego? Even the word intact to describe a hymen is inaccurate. It doesn't break, but instead most often thins naturally over time.
We all too dismissively go down the road of boys will be boys and it's evolution, creating false narratives to support these misogynistic paradigms around sexuality and attraction. But why would we think otherwise in a world where misogyny runs so deep into our culture and understanding of gender roles? Even Darwin, someone so embedded in our education system, was an early proponent of this dark idea of evolutionary sexual selection where the will of the female is fought over and won by the rivalry of the males. And these conclusions, in all their inaccuracy, become distortedly self-justifying to keep things as they are, unchallenged, accepted, excused.
It stands to be boldly stated that women's sexuality in all its diversity is just as valid and valuable as men's. The idea that any woman is establishing her own sexual identity is somehow simply doing so for the male pleasure and doing a disservice to their gender is exclusionary, reductive, and simply not true.
A symptom of the same issue is the equally damaging idea that men, on the other hand, constantly want sex and believe this in themselves to be true, which also needs to be heavily challenged. Arguably, this idealization of virginity and purity is not even rooted in male pleasure, but rooted in male control. The idea that a man having and expressing emotions is a sign of male weakness will, in turn, weaken his ability to feel pleasure, if vulnerability makes you weak, because he's disconnected from his inner self.
And yet this following the steps, penetration-focused representation of sex is the norm, despite research showing the importance of outerplay for women's pleasure. We sincerely hope that education around different diverse sexual identities becomes more and more readily accessible.
We want to acknowledge that we're potentially challenging people with this next thought. Monogamy was originally embedded in the values of powerful men and the ownership of women. In the past, women's entire safety and livelihood was dependent on just being kept by a man. Historical accounts trace an irrevocable shift in the status of women to the agricultural revolution when women, along with land, slaves, and livestock, could be possessed. And paternal investment became profoundly relevant now that things could be passed down. Many people, knowingly or unknowingly, carry on aspects of these traditions where women had to do things for pure survival, regardless of the fact that the climate is changing.
Structures of monogamy discourage people from connecting with their authentic selves, because that's not how to survive if the goal is to maintain a very specific coupling. Monogamy is built around the fear of losing our partner, so much so that we enforce sexual exclusivity to prevent it, the relationship itself taking priority over the individual's needs. To be clear, when we speak about monogamy, we are speaking about the specific established structure as opposed to having just one partner.
And so here lies our problem. The idea of our partner sleeping with someone else as the ultimate threat and betrayal is a fundamentally misogynistic issue whereby the woman's value is profoundly determined by the ownership and objectification of her sexuality. Even examining the everyday language that we choose to use can be uncomfortably revealing. Finding a man versus finding a girl highlights the value placed not only on women's bodies but also on women's youth. We often hear the phrase man and wife in marriage, as well as she's mine, she belongs to me, all reinforcing the ownership of a woman and her body that stem from this tradition of exclusivity.
Sexual exclusivity can also perpetuate the glorification of another toxic, over-romanticized trait, possessiveness. Male jealousy and possessiveness are notably problematic because they cannot be removed from these historical and ever-present power dynamics. It also perpetuates the myth that male insecurity is more important than their partner's freedom. There are many forms of indoctrination that glorify possessiveness, even teaching some people to actively seek it out, rooted in the misnomer that it could create a sense of feeling wanted, valued, or secure by being someone's only. It's understandable, but something that needs to be challenged. The fact that he's willing to suppress her because he loves her so much is the same as a person that is willing to abuse her because he loves her so much, perhaps obsessively and misguidedly. Jealousy does not mean a deeper, more vulnerable love, as it often manifests in dangerous and unhealthy ways.
The whole connection of two monogamous people can seem defined by this one overbearing rule of exclusivity, a connection that could oh so easily fall apart if it's disobeyed. Sex takes on a wildly defining role in relationships simply because of its unattainability anywhere else. Even to be sexually compared to somebody else can feel like being thrown out the door. This fear of being replaced, discarded, or your partner stolen is a specific trauma cycle associated with and perpetuated by monogamy. We get indoctrinated into this from such a young age as we watch Disney movies that one day a woman's life will be good because a man will stroll along with whom she has nothing in common, whom she's never met before, doesn't know her personality, and yet will nonetheless give her the happily ever after. Healthy relationships are built on communication, empathy, mental compatibility, and arguably the opposite of jealousy, compersion, the feeling of joy from other people's pleasure, particularly the celebration of a partner's connection with others, sexual or otherwise.
Let's face it, exclusivity does not actually provide security or safety. People still cheat because they fundamentally desire other experiences. One of the most popular dating sites is Ashley Madison, a place for affairs. More relationships end in divorce than don't. And how many relationships of long-term marriages are even the pinnacles of health? Instead, exclusivity is about the avoidance of addressing insecurities around trust and value. Anything that encourages people to disconnect from their fundamental desires just to maintain a value and avoid confronting insecurities around their sexual worth within the relationship is inherently problematic. This goes back to the past from the rather dangerous myth that if we lose our partner, we lose everything. For women, historically, this could mean the fear of getting ostracized, shamed, and even murdered.
And so, hypothetically, if monogamous relationships do remove the exclusivity rule, how many people would be more comfortable having their partners engage in a one-night stand with a person of the same versus of the opposite sex? The fact that there's even a distinction to many is interesting. A lot of men are fine with their female partner being with another woman, but not with another man. There is this rule known as the one penis policy, rooted in misogyny and sexism, but also homophobia, meaning that the woman can sleep with as many women as she wishes, but no other men, which is to think that a man is a threat and a woman is not. This idea that lesbian relationships are not a threat means that they are perceived as less valuable than heterosexual relationships, reinforcing a lot of misogynistic perceptions of women's sexuality that we've previously spoken about.
When lesbians do appear in the media, they are often portrayed as embodying Western patriarchal ideas of femininity whilst being heavily sexualized. To address this, it's not a misnomer, it's a fundamental aspect of the dehumanization of women, this idea that women exist solely for the male gaze. If he truly saw his partner as bisexual, then women would be just as much of a threat to the relationship. Ultimately, the biggest threat isn't genital specific. The evident rarity of a one vagina policy may indicate male freedom is more valid than female freedom. It's worth mentioning that although polyamory does not perpetuate a lot of these paradigms, the most common third person that non-monogamous couples search for is a bisexual woman, known as a unicorn, and it's no coincidence that it's a woman fulfilling this role.
A quick side point on narratives in the media. Whilst women are so often placed in passive roles, as discussed earlier, within hetero relationships, it's worth looking at the way that where active language glorifies a man's actions, it more often demonizes a woman's. For instance, when we read the headlines such as Woman slept her way to the top. The woman is framed as the active character, as opposed to several men in positions of power based her value in her sexuality and were willing to abuse that power and engage in unethical business practices in exchange for sexual gratification. This language shifts the abuser to the subheading and shifts the victim's actions, for instance, what she did, what she wore, to the heading. Her actions justify his behaviour.
It should be reiterated, pushing gender differences is at the heart of sexism and misogyny.
We wish to address the origins and symptoms which, in turn, may help us better understand how to make progress with the liberation and freedom of women and embrace the diversity, autonomy and individualism that women deserve.
It can feel all too overwhelming to confront our tough reality, but by re-examining and recontextualizing our relationship structures, we may then help ourselves better identify and fight back against this deeply entrenched power struggle that comes at the expense of women.
We thought we would finish by talking about the difference between codependency and interdependency. Monogamy glorifies the idea of people being two halves of a whole, and possibly even more distortedly, a masc half and a femme half that fill in the gaps of each other to become one.
This gender role reinforcing thought expands fiercely out of the ill-defined hierarchy of monogamous relationships beyond being someone's entire sex life to being someone's entire emotional support system, confidant, live-in partner, co-parent, and the person we can't live without. The latter is a romantic false promise that goes against listening to our fluctuating, authentic, evolving feelings, ultimately stifling intimacy.
To shift this narrative to the person we choose, the person we could survive without because we've worked on our own independence is kind. To lose our partner is to not lose everything, to value their freedom, their authenticity, their discoveries, and their individualism, as well as our own, is the kindest thing we can do.